There are many unanswered questions about Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere universe. Who was Adonalsium really? What are Hoyd's true intentions? Will Shallan ever tell a joke that's actually funny? Today, we are not going to be talking about any of that. Instead, I'm going to be diving deep into the most obscure Cosmere theories I have found emerging out of the depths of the internet. To be clear, none of these theories are my own. They come out of Reddit or the 17th Shard mostly. But I thought I would do a video on them because I think that, despite being relatively obscure, some of these could potentially be very relevant for the future of the Cosmere, and I don't see them talked about much. And also, I'm going to go ahead and put a full spoiler warning here for everything except the Secret Project. So if you're not caught up with all the Cosmere books, you might not want to watch this one. So without further ado, let's talk about Maven. Maven is obviously everybody's favorite Stormlight Archive character. No, she's not. Nobody's ever heard of her. I certainly didn't remember who she was before reading this theory courtesy of Reddit user AllDone19. But, believe it or not, she has been here from the very beginning, or almost. Maven was first introduced in Words of Radiance as one of Taravangian's servants, and in almost every single Taravangian chapter since then, she has made an appearance. But every time, she fades into the background so much that the reader is intentionally made to forget about her. That's important. According to this theory, Maven is not from Roshar. She's a world hopper and a spy, although for whom is not entirely clear. She is described as being short, which oftentimes when a character in the Stormlight Archive is described as being short, that could mean that they're a world hopper, since Rosharans tend to be, on average, taller than most other Cosmere residents on account of Roshar's lighter gravity. But that in and of itself is not enough evidence to implicate her in anything. What convinced me that there's something different about Maven is the way that Taravangian's internal monologue describes her. We all know that Brandon Sanderson loves foreshadowing and loves to include in his books all sorts of seemingly innocent phrases that turn out to have massive implications later on. And whenever Taravangian is around Maven, there are some lines that would be very ironic if it turned out later that Maven was more than she looks to be. Take a listen, for instance, to this passage from Oathbringer. Adrotagia and Dukar conversed quietly in the corner of the room, confused by portions of the diagram. They ignored Maven, the room servant, who felt Taravangian's forehead as he'd been coughing lately. What fools we can be, Taravangian said, resting fingers on the picture of flowers. We never know as much as we think. Perhaps in that, the smart me has always been the more stupid one. So Taravangian, on one of his less intelligent days, is reflecting on the way people often think they know more about the world than they don't. And meanwhile, Maven is just there. Now listen to this passage from Rhythm of War where he has some similar thoughts. He turned from the window and gave Moral a firm handshake, then an unexpected hug. He gave another to short, trustworthy Maven, the servant woman who had watched over him all this time. She handed him a small bundle of his favorite jams, all the way from Shinovar. Those were increasingly rare, now that trade into the strange country had been cut off. The diagram indicated it was likely one or more of the Unmade had set up there. Too often, Taravangian said to Maven, those who write history focus on the generals and the scholars to the detriment of the quiet workers who see everything done. The salvation of our people is as much your victory as mine. He bowed and kissed her hand. So when I first read that passage, I thought it was just a nice little snippet relating to the themes of the Cosmere, about how ordinary people often get overlooked in favor of large geopolitical scheming. But if you look at it through the lens of irony, there could be something else going on here. Taravangian's reflection that nobles and kings often forget about ordinary workers can be looked at in two ways. Sure, from one way it could be about the arrogance of nobles, forgetting that ordinary people are necessary to get the basic needs of life taken care of. But it could also be read as ironic because Taravangian himself is incapable of suspecting Maven, his servant, of any sort of treachery. Personally, I love this theory. It might not be a lot to go off of, but it feels like just the sort of thing that Sanderson would love to do, to throw in little hints like this that something might be amiss, none of which we'll pick up on until after the fact, although I guess we sort of have picked up on them now, maybe, if this theory turns out to be true, I don't know. I just think it's incredible that this character has been there all along, and yet almost nobody has drawn attention to her, at least before this theory arose. Now, there is another layer to this theory, which postulates that Maven could potentially be a Kandra, which would be very interesting. But I don't really see any textual evidence to think that she is a Kandra, personally. I think she might just be an ordinary world hopper. Even though we know that there are Kandra somewhere on Roshar, there are many different Kandra candidates out there, and Maven is only one of them. And while there's definitely something unusual about her, I don't know if we have any solid evidence to think that she's a Kandra specifically. So this next theory comes from Reddit user Windrunner67 and is about the fifth ideal of the Windrunners, which is obviously something that a lot of people like to speculate about, because if Kaladin does end up speaking the fifth ideal in the next Stormlight Archive book, that would be a huge character moment and would probably tell us a lot about where the plot is going. However, I haven't seen any other theories about the fifth ideal that are quite as compelling as this one to me. So it goes like this. Every order of the Knights of Radiant has ideals that match up to a certain degree. Even though for most of the orders we don't know all of the ideals, there is still a pretty clear escalation in each order that tell us what sort of culmination a given order's ideals might be leading towards. However, there is only one order for which we know the fifth ideal, which is the Skybreakers. And that ideal is something along the lines of, I am the law. And that tells us that maybe we should expect the fifth ideal of other orders to follow a similar pattern, where instead of practicing some sort of ideal, you become that ideal itself. And interestingly, this idea of becoming the law when you reach the fifth ideal of the Skybreakers would ordinarily be horrifying. But if you've proven yourself worthy of the previous ideals, then in a perfect world, it would be a good thing for you to become the law, because you would implement the sort of laws that would make the world a better, happier place. Taking all of this into account, we can maybe think about where the fifth ideal of the Windrunners might be taking Kaladin. It should be something that grants him a certain level of moral legitimacy, something which, if anybody else spoke it, would be horrifying, but if Kaladin spoke it, would probably be a good thing. Many of Kaladin's biggest struggles throughout the books have been about choosing who to save and who to let die. And indeed, his whole character arc in Rhythm of War was about learning to accept that there are people he can't protect. The culmination of all this, then, might not be only accepting that there are people he can't protect, but also sacrificing people in order to save the lives of others. And so the fifth ideal might be something along the lines of, I will sacrifice those I must in order to protect those entrusted to me. Which would be pretty interesting, because that would mean that Kaladin's entire character arc throughout the Stormlight Archive is about becoming a utilitarian. I'm not convinced that Kaladin, even if he knew he needed to speak these words, would actually be able to speak them. And especially considering that Kaladin's character arc has kind of already wrapped up in Rhythm of War, I'm not really sure if this is the direction Brandon Sanderson would want to take the story. It still could very well be that the fifth ideal of the Windrunners looks something like this, but will Kaladin actually go down this path, or will he remain at the fourth ideal forever? I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. So this final theory is probably my favorite, and the best thing about it is that Brandon has actually reacted to it. I'm not sure when this particular theory originated. It might have been before the Lost Metal, but after the Lost Metal, it really started to gain a lot of traction, and it's easy to see why. So it's about Yadeth, the god of the Dorethi religion on Sel, which, if it's been a while since you read Elantris, is from Elantris. This is an Elantris thing. Yadeth is interesting because it's mentioned that Yadeth speaks directly to Wyron Wolfton, the head of the Shudoreth religion. And yet, while ordinarily in the Cosmere we might think that Yadeth is some sort of shard, there are no living shards on Sel. Both Devotion and Dominion were splintered a long time ago, and so there's no way one of them could be giving direct instructions to the head of one of the main Celish religions. So then, who could this be? Well, according to this theory, Yadeth is in fact autonomy, and the Lost Metal gives us a lot of reasons to potentially think this. In the Lost Metal, autonomy speaks directly to Telsin and uses her as a sort of linchpin for her whole hierarchy on Scadrial, which is similar to the way that Yadeth acts on Sel with Wyron Wolfton. Furthermore, both the Set and the Shudoreth religion have very similar teachings. Namely, they both ostensibly value boldness, but only insofar as your boldness doesn't usurp existing hierarchies. On Scadrial, Autonomy promised to make Telsin one of her avatars, and it's easy to imagine her making a similar sort of promise to Wyron Wolfton. Or potentially Wyron Wolfton already is one of her avatars. After all, we've never seen him on screen as far as I can recall. Or on page. So if all of that wasn't convincing enough, Brandon Sanderson in a recent spoiler livestream was asked about this theory, and his reaction, dare I say, pretty much confirms it.
So is Jadith an avatar of Autonomy?
Raffo. You're a very smart person.
So yeah, interpret that Raffo how you will, but it seems to me like there's a lot of reason to believe this theory, and it makes a lot of sense that Autonomy would be interested in Cell. Because, after all, as we see in the Lost Metal, Cell has a massive source of investiture in the form of the door that can be harnessed if you can figure out how to safely harness it. And that resource could be something that a lot of Cosmere actors are interested in once they find out about it, including Autonomy. And if this theory turns out to be true, then all of you Elantris haters are going to be biting your tongues when the sequel to Elantris turns out to be one of the most interesting books in the Cosmere. So yeah, these are some theories that I found particularly interesting. There are a lot of theories about the Cosmere because the Cosmere fandom is among the most pedantic fandoms in the planet. And I'm sure I've barely even scratched the surface of the depths of the lore. So let me know if you agree with these theories or not. And also let me know in the comments whether or not you think edge dancers need to wipe their butts. Oh, and also leaving a like and subscribing would be great. If you want to. Thanks.